What would you make of a man with an iron bar driven clean through his head, who spoke within minutes and lived another 11 years? And what would you make of the claim, made only years later after he was already dead, that the man who walked away from the rock was no longer the man who had knelt down beside it? On the 13th of September 1848, on a railway cut outside Cavendish, Vermont, a foreman knelt over a hole packed with blasting powder. He pressed his iron down into it. The iron struck the rock. The rock gave a spark. His name was Phineas Gage. He was 25 years old. He had been born in the hill country of New Hampshire. The exact day is uncertain, which is the first small thing the record loses about him, and far from the last. He could read and write. Past that, his early life has gone quiet. No one thinks to write down an ordinary man until the afternoon he stops being one. He worked for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad, laying a line through the hard rock of southern Vermont. He was a blasting foreman, the man trusted to set the charges that broke the ledge apart so the track could pass. By the accounts of the men who hired him, he was good at it, steady, careful, given the most dangerous part of the work, because he could be relied on not to make the mistake that killed people. We should hold that lightly. Much of what we are told about the man he was before comes from people remembering him through the lens of what came after. But this much is plain. He did precise, patient, hazardous work, and he did it well enough to be put in charge of it. The work had a rhythm to it. You bored a hole down into the rock. You poured in the powder. You set the fuse. Then you took the iron and tamped the charge down. Gently, just enough to settle it. Then sand went in over the top, and only then did the tamp hard, backing it tight, so that when the powder caught, the force of it drove down into the stone instead of back up into the air. And he had a tool for the tamping, the iron, a long rod, tapered to a point at one end, worn smooth from use. It was not a weapon. In a day's work, it was the most ordinary thing in his hands. It was an afternoon, like the 100 afternoons before it. The only difference, the charge went off early. The iron he had set into the hole, 3 feet 7 inches of it, 13¼ pounds, came back out faster than anyone could follow. It entered below his left cheekbone, point first. It passed behind his left eye, through the front of his brain, and out through the top of his skull near the middle line. It did not stop there. It carried up into the air and came down into the dirt some 80 feet behind him, smeared with what it had taken out on the way through. Phineas Gage was thrown onto his back. His limbs moved in a few convulsions, and then he went still. Within a few minutes, he started speaking. His men, and by Harlow's account he was a favorite among them, gathered him up and carried him to the road. They sat him into an ox cart, and Phineas Gage rode the 3/4 mile into Cavendish sitting upright, holding himself that way more or less the whole way, awake and aware of the men around him and of what had just happened to his head. At the hotel of a man named Joseph Adams, he climbed down from the cart largely on his own, with a little help He walked up a long flight of stairs. The first doctor reached him not long after. Then came John Harlow, the physician who would spend the rest of his own life bound to the life of Phineas Gage. By Harlow's account, Gage met him sitting up, clear-headed, and remarked of the hole in his own skull that there was business enough for the doctor. He was making conversation. He was, the record insists, entirely rational. Harlow examined the wound. He could see the brain moving in it. To trace the path the iron had taken, he set the index finger of one hand into the opening of the top of the skull, and the index finger of the other into the wound in the cheek, and inside the head, the two fingers met. The bar had gone straight through. The man it had gone through was sitting in front of him, talking. Harlow did what the medicine of 1848 allowed. He drew out loose fragments of bone, pressed the larger displaced pieces of skull back into place, closed the wound at the crown of the head, and cleaned what he could. Then he waited, because there was nothing else to be done. For a time, Gage held. Then the wound turned. By the end of September, it had become infected, and he sank away from the world. For something like 10 days, he lay half-conscious, answering only when spoken to, and then only in single words. His face swelled. It is said that his family had a coffin made ready. This, not the iron, not the blast, was the thing most likely to kill him. Harlow found the abscess. He opened it and drained it. The fever broke. The swelling fell away, and Gage came back. On the 7th of October, he took his first step. By the 20th, Harlow noted he had grown restless and childlike. By the middle of November, some 65 days after the iron passed through his head, he was walking the house and telling Harlow he felt no pain in it at all. 10 weeks after the accident, he went home to Lebanon, New Hampshire. The following April, Harlow saw him a last time as a patient and judged him well. He had lost the sight of his left eye. One side of his face never fully moved again. He carried the marks of the entry and the exit for the rest of his life. But he could walk and speak and reason and remember. By every measure, the body could be held to. Phineas Gage had recovered. The man who could not have lived had lived, and the people who came to see him, the doctors at first, and soon enough the merely curious, found a man who could sit with them and describe calmly exactly what had happened to him. When Phineas Gage was well enough to work again, the work would not take him back. The railroad did not return him to his place as foreman. The contractors who had once trusted him with the most dangerous job on the line found reasons not to. Why exactly is a question the record only answers later, and from a single source. So he made his living the way a man does when the trade he knew has close to him. For a time, by Harlow's account, though no one else set it down, he put himself on display, the iron in his hands, at Burnham's Museum in New York, the man who had survived the unsurvivable, 13¼ pounds of evidence to prove it. He spent some months at the stable in Hanover, New Hampshire, tending horses and couches, and then Around 1852, he left the country altogether. A man was building a stagecoach line in Valparaiso in Chile, and Phineas Gage went with him to drive. For close to 7 years, on the far side of the world, the man with the hole through his skull held the reins of a team on mountain roads, kept to schedule, managed the animals and the route and the passengers, day after day after day, whatever the iron had taken from him. It had not taken that. In 1859, his health began to fail, and he left Chile for San Francisco, where his mother and sister had settled years before. He recovered enough to work again, this time on a farm south of the city. In February of 1860, he had a seizure, then another. They came harder and closer together. On the 21st of May 1860, 11 and a half years after the iron went through his head, Phineas Gage died in a run of convulsions in California. He was about 36 years old. There was no autopsy. His brain, the thing the whole world would one day want to study, was buried with him and never examined. He was laid in a cemetery in San Francisco, and that, for a while, was the end of it. 7 years later, in 1867, his body was lifted out of the ground. His skull was carried east and placed in the hands of John Harlow, the doctor who had fitted the pieces of it back together 19 years before. Harlow had been trying to learn what became of his patient. Now, he had the man's skull on his desk, and the iron beside it. In 1868, Harlow published what he had found, and it is here, 20 years after the accident, 8 years after the man himself was dead, that the Phineas Gage the world remember is made. In his first report written in 1848, while Gage sat recovering in front of him, Harlow had described no change in the man's character. When Henry Bigelow examined Gage in 1850 and presented him to the students at Harvard, he described none either. For 2 decades, the record of Phineas Gage was a record of survival, and nothing more. The 1868 report was quite different. Now Harlow wrote that the balance in Gage between his intellect and his impulses had been broken, that he had turned profane in a way he never had been, restless, unreliable, fixed on plans he had made and abandoned in the same breath, obstinate and unsteady at once. A man, Harlow wrote, with the mind of a child and the appetites of a grown man, and he set down that those who had known Phineas Gage before the iron said of the man who had come after that he was no longer Gage. Phineas Gage was not there to be asked. He had been dead 8 years. The account that would make him the most famous patient in the history of the brain was built from Harlow's memory, from what Gage's mother could recall, and from second-hand report. After all, the only man who could have answered was laying in the ground in California. It is the line that survived. It went into the lectures and then the textbooks, and it is there still. In something like 2 of every 3 introductory books on psychology written since, a man reduced to a single sentence about what he lost, a sentence sat down by someone else, after he was gone. And it may be true, a brain can be injured and a person can change. And Harlow was the one doctor who knew him across all of it. There is no reason to think he lied. But it sits against the other things the record holds. It sits against 7 years of driving a coach on time on mountain roads in a country where he knew no one, work that asked for exactly the steadiness the account says he had lost. It sits against a doctor in South America who the research suggests found Gage in good health, with no harm done to his mind at all. It sits against the case made by the people who have studied him most closely, that whatever changed in him may have changed back, slowly, across years of ordinary work, that the ruined man of the textbooks was real for a time, and then was not. And it sits against his face, because for more than a century and a half, there was no face. The most famous injury in the history of human brain belonged to no one, until a few years ago, a photograph surfaced. It had been sitting in a private collection, labeled as a one-eyed whaler holding a harpoon. It was Phineas Gage. He is holding the iron. He is well dressed, his hair neat, his ruined eye closed, his gaze level and steady on whoever stood behind the camera. He does not look like a man the world had given up on. He looks like a man who knew exactly what had happened to him and had chosen to be photographed with it. The iron rests at Harvard now, in a glass case beside his skull and a cast of his living face. There is an inscription on it, cut while he was still alive. It names the man it passed through, but it spells his name wrong. Phineas, with a letter he never used. And it gives the date of the accident as the 14th of September. It happened on the 13th. So this is what remains. A skull, an iron that misspells him and misdates the day it nearly killed him, a photograph found by accident of a calm man the story forgot, and one sentence written by someone else 8 years after he died that the world chose to keep in place of all the rest. Whether the iron took Phineas Gage from himself, or whether we did, quietly afterward. Because a ruined man is a better story than a man who got up and went back to work. The record does not say, it only holds the pieces, and it holds them still. The record remembers.